Okay, guys, now that we've talked about all of these different things, the Europeans moving into the New World and the effects on the natives and slavery and this or that, so now we're going to get into actually how kind of the cultural things that change and these impacts that have occurred in the Americas. Now, obviously, the slave trade is the biggest thing here, and we have to look at the impact not only in America but also in Africa. Okay, the numbers were staggering. You saw from the last set of notes 12.5 million people at least removed. To give you an idea, by the late 1700s or the 1780s, over 88,000 people per year. Um, Now, if you were way inland, you were okay until the Europeans show up later. But what really develops, and this is something that still exists today, is that you've got massive tribal issues. You had some tribes like the Asante, the Dahomey, or the Oyo, who were these coastal tribes that actually benefited, developed into kingdoms, and would stay strong really until the early 1800s until the Europeans decided to conquer them. And as you can see on the right here is a picture of African slaves being transported to the coastline. And you can see here with these slave traders right here in the hats possessing firearms. And so these tribal issues, this is something that's not forgotten. And if we look at Africa today, you see a lot of tribal wars and other types of issues that have developed, and a lot of it goes back to this particular time period, as well as European involvement later, which we'll talk about. But what also really helped a lot, or not helped, but hurt a lot of these areas, would be the massive loss of population. That is not a good thing because that would not enable these groups to be industrious, to build large societies, or really be in a position of strength when the Europeans come back to call. Now, in the Americas, of course, you do have the Plantation Society develop, and as you see here on the right, this is a sugar plantation. And I think really the biggest impact of that still impacts us tremendously today was the development of what we refer to as racism. When one society enslaves another society, inherently the enslavers feel superior. And of course, we know it's as a result of technological means and trade and things along that line. But what this will develop in these foolish notions, and of course, wrong, but doesn't matter, the ideas of European culture being superior to African culture, the racist tendencies that exist today, and the problems that people have, because this is when this starts to be taught. And this hasn't gone away. I mean, you even have certain African groups that have different racial attitudes toward each other as well, something we'll be getting into in class. But that's been, I think, the most devastating. And you learned last year in US 2, where the kids will learn in US 2 about the civil rights movement and things like that. And even though I think we've come a lot further and we are better than we were, we still have a long way to go. Now, this doesn't mean that the slave groups didn't resist. You had a variety of different ways, from anything from sabotage to people breaking tools and not working as hard, all the way to slave revolts, as you see a picture on the right. Unfortunately, the problem with slave revolts is in the end, they don't really work. They might result in massive death and destruction, but ultimately the guys with guns show up, and most slave groups did not. And that's not really going to work out well for you. Something very interesting that develops that we'll be talking a little bit more about lately, though, would be runaway slave groups, particularly in areas like, say, Haiti, all the way to Brazil. Now, these slaves that ran away were able to set up these communities, and they were known as Maroons. And this will develop an entire class of free blacks that will result in different types of societal impacts depending on where you will actually live. And some of these groups would have a lot of success and even have their own agricultural system as well as economic systems. We'll actually see a group like that in Haiti, where you also have the only slave revolt to actually ever win. But there's going to add a different dynamic growing forward, because what you will end up seeing is that the Americas become a place of massive what's the word I want to look for? Diversity. Now, unfortunately, this diversity will also result in class systems, but it also results in some positive things later on. Now, eventually, slavery will end. You will get more and more revolts in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then you will get the development of the abolition movements, as well as I have here media awareness. You'll have books like you might have learned about in US 1, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and other things, they written by Sojourner Truth. We'll be talking about groups like that later on. The slave trade eventually gets banned. Like, for instance, Denmark was the first nation to ban it in 1803, the United Kingdom in 1806, the United States in 1807. Now, abolition takes a little bit longer. One of the first countries to abolish slavery will be the United Kingdom in 1833, France in 1848, the United States in 1865, Brazil in 1888, but then some groups go much, much further. For instance, Mauritania doesn't ban slavery until 1981. So it is something that's going to take a while, and we'll talk about really the development of that and the impact that that can have culturally. The other impact that you actually also see here is the impact of Europeans on the native groups in North, Central, and South America. And the biggest group that had the influence, of course, would be the Spanish. Now, when the Spanish come in, they initially try to be very much separate. And we talked about this. They will go on this just destruction of cultures and doing everything they can do. They destroy the city of Tenochtitlan, they enslave people, they ban cultural expression, they replace their languages. If you notice in the Americas today, of course, you have Spanish and Portuguese and French and English, but no one's really speaking Mayan or Aztec or Zapotec. That's pretty much all gone. And what's really going to develop in these areas are a strict societal system, almost like a caste system that we saw in India. And if you look on the right, you have this group where initially it would just be the actual Spanish in charge, and then you had the Creoles, who are the descendants of them, and then you have this group called the Mestizos. Now, we talked about that with the groups that would intermarry, and so they're the descendants of natives and Europeans. And then you have the groups known at that time, mulattoes, which now is kind of an inappropriate thing to say, which is somewhat of mixed racial background. But if you come across this on the AP test, we need to know what it's all about. And that's going to be interesting because in some societies, for instance, in Central and South America, if you had a parent that was a European and then a parent that was African, you actually would take after the European and you can move up in society. In the Americas, it was actually reversed, and it really, in North America, it wouldn't work out that way. And then, of course, slaves on the bottom. And what you have here, again, is this diversity, but a strict caste system that will develop that eventually will result in massive amounts of revolutions later on. Okay, but it's going to take a while. But you see these very stratified societies that everything has to go through the Europeans. The British, on the other hand, they were having no intermarriage. It was complete separation. Sometimes you would have trade, much like we said the French did, but eventually it comes to the ideas that the Europeans really don't see the natives as equal. They see them as heathens, they see them as savages. They're also not Christian, so they don't really care about them that way. And they also feel that the natives don't use the land the right way. They don't clear-cut farm and things like that, so they have every right to take them over. And a great example of this would be something like you see this map over here, King Philip's War, that was fought in both Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, which was all the Massachusetts Bay Colony back in the 1600s, from 1675 to 1676, a series of excursions between the British settlers and the natives. Eventually the natives lost and were forced to leave, and this will really set up kind of the theme that you will slowly but surely see over time. You also have massive religious changes. In the Americas, you will see the push for Christianity, Catholicism without a doubt being just the absolute huge one. As you can see, Catholicism you see up here in the French-speaking parts of Canada, as well as parts of the United States, and then all of South America. The vast majority of the people here are Catholic. You do have in here some tribal religions in the Amazon area, and then you also have Protestantism. And really, the ancient religions that we talked about were all but gone. You almost can't go anywhere, for instance, in Latin America without running into a Catholic church. There are tons of churches in here because you have the British that settle the United States, mostly British and many Huguenot French, and so you see lots of Protestant religions there. But then you also see some blending of religions, like for instance, a blend of African religions with Christianity, and many of these religions are known as syncretic religions, in which you have a blending of two different types of religions that come together. Like, for instance, a lot of African religions in the New World will also blend with Christianity to kind of create kind of this spiritual, monotheistic type of religion. Like, for instance, saints will take the place of African spirits, and so on and so forth. You see a lot of African music impacting these religions as well. Like, for instance, gospel music is actually a blend of African hymns and Christian songs that all come together to form a unique religion. And you can see it coming together. Like, for instance, you see this picture on the right. This was taken in 2011 in England when you had religious leaders across the world. You have Muslim and Hindu and Anglican, Muslim again. There is a patriarch of Christianity right here. This is Orthodox. Here's the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anglican, and there's Pope Benedict. So you can see this happening. And one of the best examples of that was the Vodun religion, which is also known as Voodoo, which came over from West Africa. And what it is, it's a combination of, you kind of have this one creator God, which they get from Christianity that runs everything. But then you get this idea of spirits. Different ethnicities worship different spirits, and there's lots of spirits that can actually impact you on a day-to-day basis. And spirits are almost alive and interacting. And you have two groups of people. You have the priestesses that can communicate with the spirits that are healers, and they help people survive. And then you have the sorcerers who can use the power of spirits to do whatever they want, sometimes good, sometimes bad. This is where you get like the voodoo dolls and things along that line. Sometimes they include animal sacrifice as well, but you can see like a bunch of different polytheistic religions, Christianity, all kind of blending together. But nonetheless, we see a massive cultural change in the New World because of the Europeans. Much of the old ways disappear, as well as the impact of slavery as well. And we'll be getting into more of this as we go, but this is kind of our initial introduction. All right, so make sure you get your questions and comments, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.